Nevada, December 2025. The hearing room smelled like floor polish and fear. Marcus Thorne stood at the witness table, maintenance coveralls still carrying traces of hydraulic fluid from yesterday's shift. Across the room, Victoria Ashford sat rigid at the defense table, flanked by lawyers in suits that cost more than Marcus earned in 6 months. The gallery was packed journalists, aviation executives, families who'd flown Skywing without knowing their lives hung on deferred maintenance and falsified logbooks. Board Chairman Gloria Patterson adjusted her reading glasses, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years at the FAA before retirement had pulled her into regulatory oversight. The charges she read felt like stones dropping into still water, each one sending ripples through the assembled crowd. 14 counts: safety fraud, falsification of federal maintenance records, obstruction, conspiracy. Victoria's lawyer leaned close, whispering something urgent. She shook her head once sharp. Her eyes hadn't left Marcus since he'd entered, calculating, reassessing. He could see the moment recognition failed to arrive. She still saw custodial staff, still saw the man who'd mopped her floors for 3 years, while she walked past without a second glance. Marcus opened his briefcase. The papers inside represented more than documentation. They represented every night he'd stayed awake while Nova slept, cataloging violations by the glow of a laptop screen older than most smartphones. Every photograph taken with hands that had scrubbed toilets that same day. Every voice memo recorded in public spaces where the law permitted single-party consent, where powerful people spoke freely because janitors were furniture, part of the landscape invisible. He pulled the stack free. 241 pages properly formatted, cross-referenced, time-stamped. The kind of evidence package that only came from someone who understood both aerospace systems and federal regulatory procedures. His voice came out steady, calm, the voice of a man who'd learned that power respected composure more than rage. Before we proceed, I need to correct something for the record. Victoria's posture shifted, just slightly, enough to tell Marcus she was listening now. Really listening the way she should have listened 3 years ago, when he'd tried to warn her about metal fatigue in a hydraulic line that would have killed her if she'd taken flight that day. My name is Marcus Thorne, not M. James Webb as listed in Skywing's employment records. The journalist leaned forward. Pens moved across notebooks. Someone in the back row activated a recording device, the tiny red light blinking like a warning beacon. I hold a master's degree in aerospace engineering from MIT. I worked 13 years at Lockheed Martin Skunk Works before being terminated in 2021. Victoria's lawyer dropped his pen. It clattered against the table, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. He bent to retrieve it, movements jerky, no longer projecting the confidence he'd carried into the room. For 3 years, I documented every safety violation at this company, not as an employee hoping for advancement, not as a competitor gathering intelligence, as a witness, as someone who'd seen this exact pattern destroy careers and nearly kill test pilots. And today I'm presenting this evidence to this board and to federal investigators who've been copied on every file. Victoria stood, her chair scraping back. The motion carried fury and something else, betrayal, perhaps, though Marcus couldn't fathom how someone who'd lied systemically for 6 years felt entitled to that particular emotion. You lied on your application. Her voice cut through the room, sharp enough to draw blood. You falsified your credentials, your background. Your Marcus let the moment breathe. Let her words hang there, exposed for what they were. Deflection, the last desperate move of someone who knew the walls were collapsing. No, ma'am. I used my middle name, James, and my mother's maiden name, Webb. Both legally permissible. You never asked for education verification beyond high school diploma. You ran a background check that confirmed I had no criminal record and acceptable credit. Nothing more. He paused, letting the next words land with full weight. You never asked because you assumed a black man mopping floors couldn't possibly be an engineer. You saw custodial staff. You saw invisible. And that assumption, that blindness, is what allowed me to document everything you did. The room erupted, journalists shouting questions, board members conferring in urgent whispers. Victoria's lawyer pulling her back down into her chair, his hand on her shoulder, firm enough to bruise. Gloria Patterson's gavel cracked 3 times before order returned, fragile and temporary. Marcus remained standing, calm-centered. The eye of a storm he'd spent 3 years building, one photograph at a time, one recording at a time, one night of lost sleep at a time, while his daughter asked why they couldn't afford new shoes. The chairman's voice cut through the chaos. We'll hear Mr. Thorne's testimony in full. All parties will have opportunity to respond. But right now, this hearing is about evidence, not employment disputes. She looked at Marcus directly, and something passed between them. Recognition of someone who'd paid a price for speaking truth, who understood that whistleblowers rarely got parades, usually got crucified, and sometimes if they were lucky and thorough and patient, got justice delayed but not denied. Mr. Thorne, before we proceed to your evidence presentation, I want to establish timeline and context. When did you begin employment at Skywing Aviation? January 2023. Night shift custodial, 15.50 per hour. And when did you begin documenting safety violations? First week, January 10th specifically. The screen behind Marcus flickered to life, controlled by the board's technical staff. The first image appeared a maintenance log photographed from above, date stamp, visible Rafael Ortega's signature clear at the bottom, beside a checkbox marked complete for an inspection that, according to Marcus's next photograph, had never happened. The fuel filter still carried the same serial number 3 months later. But that would come later. First, they needed to understand how he'd arrived in that hangar, camera in hand, career in ruins, wife dead, daughter depending on him. Nothing left to lose except the last shred of integrity that Lockheed Martin hadn't managed to strip away. The chairman gestured for him to sit. 3 years earlier, March 2021. Tell us what happened at Lockheed Martin. The conference room at Lockheed's Palmdale facility had windows that looked out over the runway where classified aircraft took flight under cover of darkness. Marcus had sat in that room dozens of times, design reviews, safety briefings, program updates, where slide decks carried classification markings, and everyone signed in non-disclosure reminders before the meeting started. This time the HR director sat across from him with a folder that wasn't classified, just damning, 3 pages. Termination with cause, ethics violation, conflict of interest. The evidence was thin manufactured, barely concealing the reality underneath. 3 bottles of wine from a contractor he'd worked with for 5 years. Total retail value $180. A golf outing where they'd discussed avionics integration over 18 holes and mediocre sandwiches. Standard industry practice. The kind of thing that happened at every aerospace company in America, documented in calendars and expense reports, tacitly approved until someone needed a reason to get rid of a problem employee. The problem in Marcus's case had nothing to do with wine or golf. 6 months earlier, he'd filed a formal safety report through Lockheed's internal channels. Control system flaw in a classified helicopter program. The kind of defect that looked minor on paper, timing issue, redundancy, could theoretically compensate, but that Marcus's analysis showed could cascade under the specific flight conditions into catastrophic failure. His supervisor had told him to drop it. The program was too far along, too expensive to delay. The customer had deadlines. The contract had penalty clauses. Besides, redundancy would catch it. Probably, Marcus had taken it higher. Written documentation, technical analysis, failure mode scenarios. Everything by the book, through proper channels, doing exactly what his training and professional ethics demanded. 2 weeks later, the investigation into his alleged conflict of interest had begun. Now the HR director pushed the termination agreement across the table. Sign here. Take the severance. $45,000. More than generous given the circumstances. Or we proceed with formal ethics charges, which will go on your permanent record, which will follow you to any aerospace company in this country. On Marcus's phone, Isabel's oncologist had left a voicemail that morning. The cancer was spreading faster than the chemo could contain it. Stage 4. Metastatic. They were looking at months, not years. She needed him present, not fighting legal battles against a company with unlimited resources and every incentive to protect a billion-dollar program. At home, Nova was 5 years old. She'd drawn a picture that morning, stick figure family, 3 people holding hands, son in the corner with a smile. She'd labeled them in careful kindergarten letters, Mommy, Daddy, Nova. The picture was already outdated. Soon it would be 2. Marcus signed. The pen felt like surrender, like complicity, like every compromise that led good people into moral crevices they couldn't climb out of. But Isabel needed him. Nova needed him. Fighting Lockheed meant lawyers' depositions, months of uncertainty, while his wife died and his daughter learned that principals didn't pay for groceries. He took the severance check, cleaned out his desk, drove home to his dying wife, and told her everything would be fine because lies sometimes were merciful. Isabel died on a Tuesday, breast cancer, 43 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. Marcus had counted, every day watched the morphine doses increase, held her hand through the worst hours when pain made her delirious, and she called for her mother who'd been dead for a decade. The end came early morning, Nova still asleep in her room. Isabel's breathing had changed during the night. Shallower, irregular, the death rattle hospice nurses warned about, but that no clinical description could prepare you for. She'd opened her eyes one last time, focused on Marcus with effort that seemed to cost everything she had left. Promise me, her voice barely audible. Take care of Nova. Show her the world is bigger than this, bigger than fear, bigger than the people who tried to make you small. I promise. Good. She'd smiled then or tried to. The morphine made her features slack, but her eyes held something Marcus would carry forever, not resignation, but release. The knowledge that she'd fought as long as she could, that her daughter would be loved, that sometimes letting go was his own kind of courage. She'd stopped breathing 3 minutes later. Peaceful, the hospice nurse said, which was true, and also meaningless, because death wasn't peaceful for the living, for the 6-year-old who woke up asking why daddy was crying, why mommy wouldn't wake up, why everything good had to end. The funeral ate most of the severance. Burial cost medical bills. The insurance hadn't covered the reception, where people Marcus barely knew told him Isabel was in a better place, as if heaven was consolation for a child losing her mother before she'd learned to read chapter books. Afterward, the math became unavoidable. No job. 18 months of unemployment stretching ahead because aerospace companies talked to each other, because Lockheed's termination followed him like a scarlet letter, because every application that asked about previous employment became an exercise in explaining why ethics violations weren't really violations, just retaliation, just power protecting itself. No one hired him, not Boeing, not Northrop Grumman, not the smaller contractors desperate for talent. The engineering recruiters stopped returning calls. The networking contacts went silent. The industry had spoken. By November 2022, Marcus's bank account showed $86. The rent was due in 3 days. Nova needed winter clothes had outgrown. Last year's coat wore shoes with soles separating from the uppers. The food bank provided basics, but basics didn't include the science kit she'd asked for, the one that came with a microscope and slides for examining pond water, the one that cost $25 Marcus didn't have. The employment counselor in Cleveland had been kind at least. Realistic but not cruel. Someone with your background, with your termination circumstances. You're not getting back into aerospace. Not for years, maybe never. So we look at adjacent fields at positions where your skills transfer. She'd pulled up listings, manufacturing quality control, technical documentation, facilities maintenance. That last one had an opening. Skywing Aviation Reno, Nevada. Luxury charter company, night shift custodial, $15.50 per hour. Background check required but not extensive criminal history and credit only. Start date flexible. Housing available nearby, cost of living lower than Cleveland. Marcus stared at the listing. MIT degree. 13 years of classified aerospace programs. Top secret clearance he could never use again. All of it reduced to mopping floors in a hangar where people who'd never designed anything more complex than a spreadsheet would walk past him like furniture. Nova had asked that morning if they were going to have to move. Her voice small, worried. She'd already lost her mother. Now she could sense the instability the way children always did, the fear that loss was contagious, that everything solid could dissolve. He applied that afternoon, used his middle name, which was in his mother's maiden name, Webb, to avoid Google searches connecting him to Lockheed. The background check came back clean. Criminal history, none. Credit acceptable given recent medical expenses. Education, verification not requested. The offer came 2 days later. Start date January 3rd, 2023. He told Nova they were going on an adventure. New city, new school, fresh start. She'd cried anyway because children weren't stupid, because adventure was adult code for running away. But eventually she'd helped him pack their small apartment into boxes that fit in the Honda Civic, and they'd driven west through winter storms toward Nevada, and a future that looked nothing like the one Isabel had imagined when they'd named their daughter after the brightest star they could see from the hospital window the night she was born. Reno greeted them with desert cold and thin air. The apartment Marcus could afford ran $850 per month for a 1-bedroom studio. Nova took the bedroom. He slept on the couch he'd bought used from Craigslist for $70, springs poking through fabric worn thin by previous tenants' failures. The school bus picked Nova up at 7:15 a.m. Marcus walked her to the stop every morning, watched until the bus disappeared, then returned to sleep 3 hours before his shift started. Night work. Midnight to 8 a.m. meant he could be there when Nova got home at 3:30, could help with homework, make dinner from whatever stretched furthest, pasta, rice, beans, chicken when it was on sale. The routine settled into something almost bearable. Nova adjusted faster than he did, made friends with other kids whose parents worked odd hours or multiple jobs, learned that new shoes weren't guaranteed, and that science kits remained aspirational. She didn't complain. That was worse somehow. Complaints meant hope that things could be different. Her quiet acceptance meant she was learning the lesson Marcus had tried to protect her from, that the world ground down dreamers, that speaking up meant losing everything, that survival required making yourself small. Skywing Aviation occupied a private terminal on the south side of Reno Tahoe International. The facility was immaculate, all glass and steel, and corporate messaging about luxury travel experiences. The hangar held 4 Augusta AW-139 helicopters and 2 Cessna Citation jets. The maintenance bay smelled like hydraulic fluid and money. Marcus's first night, the shift supervisor handed him an ID badge that read M. Webb, custodial, and a cart loaded with industrial cleaners. The orientation lasted 20 minutes. Don't touch aircraft. Don't enter restricted areas without escort. Don't bother the day staff. Empty trash mop floors, clean bathrooms. Invisible work for invisible people. He started with the bathrooms. Executive washroom on the 3rd floor carried the scent of expensive soap and entitlement. Someone had left a Wall Street Journal on the counter open to an article about aviation industry growth. Record profits. Expanding markets. The future looked bright for luxury charter services. Marcus scrubbed toilets and read about the industry he used to help build. The pattern revealed itself within a week. Not dramatically. Just small inconsistencies visible to someone who knew what to look for, who'd spent 13 years understanding how maintenance schedules worked, what regulatory compliance looked like, where corners got cut, when pressure mounted and oversight stayed minimal. A maintenance log left on a desk in the operations bay. Inspection marked complete, dated 3 days prior. But the aircraft it referenced sat in the hangar with engine cowling, still removed access panels, open work, clearly ongoing. Marcus photographed the log with his phone, then photographed the aircraft with metadata, intact GPS coordinates, timestamp, serial number visible. He didn't plan to do anything with it, just documented it. Proof that he wasn't imagining things, that the pattern he'd seen at Lockheed wasn't unique, that the rot went deeper than one company, one program, one set of executives willing to trade safety for schedule. The evidence accumulated. Fuel filters marked replaced but carrying serial numbers unchanged from previous inspections. Hydraulic lines signed off as inspected despite visible wear. Landing gear maintenance deferred past regulatory limits. Always small things, always deniable, always justified by operational necessity, client demands, business realities. Marcus kept his notebook in the Honda's glove compartment. Every night after shift, before driving home to Nova, he'd update the log. Date, time, observation, photograph, reference. The habits from Lockheed died hard, documentation protocols, evidence chains, the meticulous record-keeping that hadn't saved his career but might someday save someone else's life. He still didn't plan to use it. Whistleblowing had cost him everything once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. This was just insurance, just protection. In case Skywing tried what Lockheed had tried, in case he needed proof that he'd been right, that he'd tried, that history would record his objection, even if no one listened. November 18th, 2025. Almost 3 years into the quiet documentation. Marcus was cleaning near the Augusta helicopter that carried registration number N739TA when he noticed the fluid. Not a leak exactly, more like seepage. Dark red hydraulic fluid pooling beneath the tail rotor assembly, collecting in a pattern that suggested internal line rupture rather than external fitting failure. He set down his mop, moved closer. The access panel showed recent work, fresh torque marks on the fasteners, the kind that came from maintenance activity within the past week. But the maintenance log on the nearby workbench showed the last tail rotor inspection completed 3 weeks ago, signed off by Rafael Ortega, with a checkbox marked all systems nominal. Marcus knelt, examined the line without touching it. The rubber showed stress fractures, the kind of metal fatigue that developed over thousands of flight hours when inspection intervals got stretched, when parts ran past manufacturer recommendations, when cost-cutting turned maintenance scheduling from preventive to reactive. His mental calculations ran automatically. Hydraulic pressure rating 3,000 psi. Visible crack propagation suggested 70% structural integrity loss. Rupture probability under load approached 94%. Time to catastrophic failure once the rotor engaged 12 to 18 minutes, depending on flight profile and stress factors. The math was clear. This aircraft would fail. Not might, would, and when it did, anyone aboard would have seconds to respond before losing tail rotor authority, before the helicopter entered an uncontrolled spin, before physics and gravity did what they always did when safety became negotiable. Voices echoed from the main entrance. Victoria Ashford's heels clicked against polished concrete, distinctive even at distance. She was leading a group Texas accents, expensive suits, the swagger of oil executives used to helicopter commutes between rigs and regional airports. Marcus straightened, caught himself. His instinct was to find Raphael to pull the mechanic aside to handle this through proper channels, the way Lockheed had taught him proper channels existed. But Lockheed had also taught him what happened when proper channels led to people who cared more about schedules than safety. And Victoria was walking toward this aircraft right now with clients who expected to fly, who'd paid premium rates for luxury service, who trusted that regulations and oversight and basic human decency meant the aircraft they boarded wouldn't kill them. He approached carefully. Not aggressive, professional. "Ma'am, excuse me, I need to report." Victoria's head turned. The dismissal in her eyes was instantaneous, reflexive. She didn't stop walking, didn't break stride, just fired the words over her shoulder like she was swatting a fly. "Not now, ma'am, it's important. The helicopter's hydraulic system shows—" She stopped then, turned fully. The Texas executives paused, curious about the interruption about the janitor, who apparently didn't understand boundaries. "I'm sorry," Victoria's voice carried the temperature of liquid nitrogen. "Did I ask for maintenance advice from the custodial staff?" The executives chuckled. Not mean laughter exactly, just the reflexive amusement of people who recognized someone stepping out of place, who understood hierarchy meant staying in your lane, who found comedy in the absurd proposition that a man pushing a mop might know something about aircraft systems. Marcus felt the weight of 15 sets of eyes. Employees paused mid-task. Mechanics looked up from workbenches. The shift supervisor stood frozen near the tool crib, caught between intervening and staying invisible. "I have training." Marcus kept his voice level. "That hydraulic line shows metal fatigue consistent with—" Victoria cut him off with a raised hand. The gesture carried more authority than words. "Training." She let the word hang there, skeptical, dismissive. "You mop floors. You empty waste bins. You exist in this facility because I allow it. Now take your cart and get away from my aircraft before I find someone who understands the word boundaries." The silence after she finished was complete. The kind that made everything worse, that amplified the humiliation, that turned a safety warning into a public spectacle about knowing your place. Marcus set the clipboard on the workbench. The maintenance log with his notes: metal fatigue, hydraulic line assembly, C4 rupture, probability 89-94%, recommend immediate grounding, lay there like evidence no one would read. He walked away. Past the smirking executives. Past the mechanics who wouldn't meet his eyes. Past Kevin Sullivan, the pilot who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to speak up, because pilots who questioned management found themselves flying cargo routes instead of luxury clients. The bathroom on the second floor became his refuge. Marcus locked himself in a stall and stood there, breathing, hands shaking with adrenaline and rage, and the bitter familiarity of this exact moment. Different company, different aircraft, same dismissal, same certainty that speaking up would cost him everything, while staying silent would cost someone else their life. His phone buzzed. Text from Nova's school. "Parent-teacher conference tomorrow, 2:15 p.m. Please confirm attendance." He confirmed. Returned the cart to the supply closet. Finished his shift. Drove home while the sun rose over mountains that looked beautiful and indifferent. Nova was already awake, working on math homework at the kitchen table that folded against the wall when they needed floor space. She looked up when he entered, smile bright, gap-toothed, carrying Isabel's features in ways that broke Marcus's heart daily. "How was work, Daddy?" "Fine, baby." "How's the homework?" "Hard." She pointed at long division. "Why we gotta learn this? Can't we just use calculators? Because understanding the why makes you powerful. Calculators just make you fast." She accepted this return to the numbers. Marcus made breakfast, cereal, milk, orange juice that was mostly water, because the real stuff cost more per gallon than gasoline. They ate together in comfortable silence, the routine that had carried them through 3 years of survival. At 7:15, they walked to the bus stop. Nova carried her backpack overstuffed with library books she'd checked out because buying books remained impossible. She'd asked last week if they could go to the bookstore, if she could pick something new. Marcus had promised soon, which they both understood meant probably never, which Nova had accepted with the grace that killed him a little more each day. The bus arrived. She climbed aboard, turned at the top step to wave. Marcus waved back. Watched until the bus disappeared, then returned to the apartment where sleep wouldn't come, because he kept seeing that hydraulic line, kept calculating failure modes, kept imagining Victoria and those executives in flight, when the line ruptured and the tail rotor authority disappeared and physics took over. He opened his laptop. The encrypted folder held 3 years of documentation, 912 photographs, 63 voice memos, detailed logs cross-referencing observations with federal aviation regulations. The file was comprehensive, methodical, damning, and useless, because whistleblowing meant becoming a target. Meant losing this job like he'd lost Lockheed, meant moving again, explaining to Nova why they couldn't have stability, teaching her that doing the right thing was code for destroying your life. Marcus closed the laptop, lay down on the couch, stared at the ceiling where water stains formed patterns like maps to places he'd never visit. The explosion 8 minutes later shook the apartment. Not loud, just a sharp crack audible even at this distance, the sound of hydraulic pressure finding weak metal and doing what pressure always did. His phone lit up. Group text from Skywing Shift Supervisor, emergency, hydraulic failure, N739TA. No injuries, aircraft grounded, on all maintenance staff report immediately. Marcus didn't move. He'd tried to warn them. They dismissed him. Now they'd learn what MIT engineering degrees knew, that luxury executives didn't, that metal fatigue didn't care about schedules, that physics wasn't negotiable, that the universe punished arrogance with exact mathematical precision. His phone buzzed again. Different number. Rafael Ortega. Marcus, you were right. The line failed during pre-flight. Kevin found your notes on the clipboard. We need to talk. Not yet. Marcus deleted the text. Whatever came next, he needed to be ready, needed documentation airtight, needed exit strategy planned, needed to protect Nova from the fallout that would arrive when powerful people realized the janitor they'd dismissed was the only person in that hangar who'd actually understood the aircraft they were gambling lives on. The retaliation came through email 3 hours later. Schedule adjustment effective immediately. 4 a.m. to noon, 7 days per week, 32 hours total. A 40% cut to already poverty wages. The message included no explanation because none was needed. Marcus had embarrassed Victoria in front of clients. She was reminding him who held power, who controlled his daughter's future, who could make his life so uncomfortable that he'd quit on his own, and they'd never have to admit firing him for being right. He did the math automatically. Old income, $2,600 per month. New income, $2,100 per month. Shortfall, $500 they didn't have. Rent, utilities. Nova's after-school program, the numbers didn't work. Nova came home at 3:30. She found him at the kitchen table calculator and bills spread out like evidence of failure. Daddy, her voice carried worry she tried to hide. You okay just working on budget, baby? Nothing to worry about. She didn't believe him. 8 years old and she could read him like Isabel used to, could sense the stress, the fear, the calculations about which bill to pay late and which necessity to cut. She set down her backpack, came to stand beside him, small hand on his shoulder. I don't need new shoes. The ones I got work fine. Marcus pulled her close. Baby, you deserve new shoes. You deserve books and science kits and a father who doesn't have to choose between rent and winter coats. You're the best daddy. Her voice muffled against his shirt. Mommy said so. Said you were smartest person she knew. The words broke something loose. Marcus held his daughter and remembered Isabel's last request. Show her the world is bigger than this. Bigger than fear. Bigger than people who tried to make you small. He'd failed at Lockheed. Let them silence him with severance and threats and the weight of a dying wife. He'd spent 3 years at Skywing being invisible, collecting evidence he never planned to use because using it meant risk and Nova needed stability. But stability built on silence wasn't stability. It was just slow-motion surrender. Teaching Nova that power always won. That speaking up meant losing that the world was exactly as small as the people who controlled it wanted it to be. That night after Nova fell asleep, Marcus opened his laptop and composed an email. To tips@washingtonpost.com, subject aviation safety fraud investigation. I have documentation of systematic safety violations at a Nevada charter aviation company. Board-level conspiracy. 3 years of evidence. Photographs, recordings, maintenance logs showing falsification of federal records. Multiple near-miss incidents. Pattern indicates 6-year cover-up. Are you interested? His cursor hovered over send. The consequences played out with crystal clarity. Victoria would retaliate harder. He'd lose this job. Nova would suffer. They'd have to move again, start over again, explain again why doing the right thing kept making their lives worse. But that hydraulic line had failed. Kevin Sullivan had found Marcus's notes. If they'd been airborne, if Victoria had taken those executives to their meeting, if the line had ruptured at altitude instead of on the ground, the math was simple. 7 dead. Fireball visible for miles. Investigation revealing what Marcus had documented What Skywing had ignored what would have been preventable if anyone had listened. He pressed send. Then, the response arrived 40 minutes later. Yes, when can we meet? Marcus stared at the two-word reply. The avalanche had started. No stopping it now. No going back to invisible, to safe, to the illusion that silence protected anyone except the people who deserved exposure. He typed his response. Friday, 2 a.m., Denny's off I-80, come alone. Then he closed the laptop and went to check on Nova. She slept peacefully, science textbook open beside her pillow, homework finished and ready for tomorrow. She had no idea her father had just guaranteed their lives would never be stable again, that the precarious balance they'd maintained was about to shatter, that doing the right thing would cost them everything. Again, but maybe this time the cost would buy something worth having. Not stability, something better, something Isabel had called bigger than the sky, something worth passing to a daughter who deserved to believe the world could be more than just survival. Marcus pulled Nova's blanket up, kissed her forehead, whispered words she couldn't hear, but that he needed to say anyway. I'm going to make you proud, baby. The way your mother was proud. The way she believed people could be when they stopped being afraid. Outside, Nevada night pressed against windows that didn't quite seal, letting in cold that Marcus couldn't afford to fully heat away. But somewhere in that darkness, a journalist was reading his email. Evidence was being evaluated. Wheels were starting to turn that would grind slow, but grind fine. Victoria Ashford thought she'd won, thought retaliation would silence him, thought janitors stayed in their place because they had too much to lose. She was about to learn what happened when you pushed too hard, when you threatened a man's child, when you mistook desperation for weakness and invisibility for ignorance. The hydraulic line had failed on the ground. This time. Next time, and Marcus's documentation proved there would be a next time, the failure would happen at altitude. And blood would be on hands that had dismissed warnings as inconvenient, that had valued schedule over safety, that had gambled with lives because consequences felt theoretical until they arrived sudden and permanent and irreversible. Marcus returned to the couch. Lay down, didn't sleep, but didn't need to. Adrenaline would carry him through Friday, through the meeting with Cassandra Drummond from the Washington Post, through whatever came after. 3 years of silence ending. 3 years of evidence about to see daylight. The reckoning wouldn't be quick, but it would be complete. And in the morning, he'd walk Nova to the bus stop. He'd tell her they might need to move again soon. He'd watch her face fall and then recover because she was strong, like her mother, resilient in ways that broke his heart. But this time, when she asked why, he'd tell her the truth. Because some people are doing wrong things, baby. And staying quiet makes us part of the wrong. Even when speaking up is hard, even when it costs us, even when it costs everything. Friday arrived carrying the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade. Marcus clocked out at noon, the new schedule, meaning he finished shifts when most people were eating lunch, when the sun sat high enough to remind him he'd become nocturnal, a creature of maintenance bays and fluorescent lighting, who emerged blinking into daylight like something unaccustomed to visibility. Nova's parent-teacher conference was scheduled for 2:15. He had 3 hours to sleep, shower, pretend exhaustion wasn't carved into his face like geological strata. The Honda's engine turned over on the fourth try, reluctant but functional, which described most things in Marcus's life lately. The elementary school occupied a building from the 70s, all brown brick and narrow windows, designed before anyone considered that children might benefit from natural light. Marcus signed in at the front office, received a visitor badge that clipped to his work shirt because he hadn't bothered changing. Let them see custodial uniform. Let them make their assumptions. He was done performing respectability for people who'd dismiss him regardless. Principal Anderson's office smelled like air freshener failing to mask old coffee. The principal sat behind a desk that had witnessed decades of difficult conversations. Budget cuts, failing students, parents who came in angry because acknowledging their child struggled meant acknowledging their own failures at dinner tables where everyone pretended everything was fine. Anderson was maybe 55, white, wearing the expression of someone who'd learned diplomacy was survival in public education. He gestured to the chairs facing his desk. Nova's teacher, Mrs. Brennan, already occupied one. The third chair held a woman Marcus didn't recognize. Expensive haircut, designer purse. The kind of casual wealth that announced itself through details rather than ostentation. Mr. Webb, thank you for coming. Anderson's voice carried professional neutrality. We wanted to discuss an incident from Wednesday involving Nova and another student. Marcus sat. What kind of incident? Mrs. Brennan leaned forward, hands clasped. The students were working on science projects. Nova and Tyler Hastings had a disagreement that escalated into name-calling. The wealthy woman shifted and Marcus understood. This was Tyler's mother, the parent who'd demanded this meeting, who'd pulled strings to ensure the principal took this seriously, who carried the confidence that came from knowing her. Phone calls got returned, her complaints got prioritized. Name calling. Marcus kept his voice level. What names? Mrs. Brennan glanced at Tyler's mother, seeking permission or reinforcement. Tyler told Nova that her father was just a janitor and she should, quote, know her place. Nova responded by calling Tyler stupid. The words settled like sediment. Know her place. The coded language that racism had learned to speak after overt slurs became socially unacceptable, the kind of phrase that allowed plausible deniability while delivering the message clear enough. You don't belong. Your father's work makes you lesser. Stay in your assigned space in the hierarchy we've constructed. Marcus looked at Tyler's mother. And you find this acceptable, your son telling an 8-year-old to know her place, Eleanor Hastings, because of course her name was Eleanor. Straightened in her chair. Boys will be boys. They argue, they say things. But your daughter's response was aggressive and inappropriate. She needs to learn respect for other families, regardless of their circumstances. The careful phrasing. Regardless of their circumstances. Not regardless of what Tyler said. Not regardless of the racism embedded in his language. Just a deflection that made Nova's accurate assessment of Tyler's intelligence into the real problem. Marcus turned to Principal Anderson. Did anyone ask Tyler where he learned that phrase, know your place? That's not playground language, that's learned. From adults, from homes where that kind of thinking is acceptable dinner conversation. Anderson shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Webb, I don't think we should make this about race. Marcus's voice stayed calm but gained edges. Tyler made it about race. He told my daughter that my work, honest work, that pays our rent and keeps her fed, makes her inferior. That's not children arguing. That's bigotry with training wheels. Eleanor stood. My son is 8 years old. He doesn't understand complex social dynamics. He made a thoughtless comment. But I won't sit here and have him accused of racism by someone who... She stopped. The next words hovered unspoken but clear. By someone like you, by someone in custodial work, by someone who should be grateful we're even having this conversation instead of just suspending your daughter. Marcus stood too, slowly, meeting her eyes with the calm that came from knowing she had nothing he wanted, no leverage that mattered more than Nova understanding her worth. Finish that sentence. By someone who, what Eleanor's mouth opened, closed. Whatever she'd planned to say dissolved under direct confrontation. People like her rarely got called out, usually got away with implications and suggestions and coded language that let them maintain deniability while delivering cruelty. The principal stepped in. Everyone needs to take a breath. This isn't productive. Nova will receive a verbal warning, Tyler as well, and I expect both children to apologize to each other. No. Marcus's voice carried finality. Nova will not apologize for defending her dignity. Tyler can apologize for his racist comment if his parents teach him why it was wrong. But my daughter has nothing to apologize for. He left before anyone could respond. Found Nova in the after-school program room, working on math worksheets while other kids played. She looked up when he entered, expression guarded, trying to read whether she was in trouble. They walked to the Honda in silence. Once inside doors closed, Marcus turned to face her. Baby, tell me exactly what happened. Nova's eyes filled. Tyler said you were just a janitor. Said I should know my place because we're not like them. Said his dad is important and yours doesn't matter. And what did you say? I said you're smarter than his dad. Said you went to MIT. Said cleaning doesn't make you dumb. Marcus pulled her close. You did exactly right. Never apologize for defending yourself or me. Never let anyone tell you honest work is shameful. But Mrs. Brennan said I was disrespectful. Sometimes disrespect to disrespectful people is the only respect you owe yourself. Nova absorbed this. Then quiet, are we going to have to move again? The question landed like a fist. 8 years old and she already knew the pattern. Speak up, face consequences, relocate, repeat. The lesson Marcus was teaching through action, even as he tried teaching something different through words. Maybe. He wouldn't lie to her. Some things are happening at my work, things that might mean changes. But wherever we go together. And we go with our dignity intact. She nodded, wiped her eyes. Can we get ice cream? We can get ice cream. They stopped at a grocery store on the way home. The ice cream aisle carried 30 varieties they couldn't afford. Nova chose the cheapest option without being asked, store-brand vanilla 2 for $5 promotion. The cashier rang them up with the bored efficiency of someone who'd stopped seeing customers as people years ago. Marcus's card declined. He tried again, same result, Bank balance $12. Ice cream cost $6.49. The line behind them was growing. A woman with a full cart sighed audibly. The cashier's expression shifted to pity, which was worse than contempt, because pity meant she saw him, saw the failure, saw the man who couldn't buy his daughter ice cream after promising. "I'll put it back." Nova's voice was small, but steady. "It's okay, Daddy." A hand reached past Marcus, credit card extended. Kevin Sullivan stood there in his pilot uniform, still wearing captain's wings, apparently shopping between flights. "I got it." Marcus's pride wanted to refuse. But Nova was watching and teaching her that accepting help when needed was weakness, would be teaching her wrong. "Thank you." Kevin handed the card to the cashier, then looked at Marcus directly. "We need to talk. About Wednesday. About that helicopter. About what happens next. Not here. There's a coffee shop 2 blocks north. I'm off for 3 hours." They left the grocery store. Nova carried the ice cream like treasure. In the parking lot, Marcus gave her the Honda keys. "Wait in the car, baby. Eat your ice cream. I need to talk to Kevin for a few minutes." The coffee shop was the kind that survived on location rather than quality. Near the airport, prices inflated coffee weak enough to see through. Marcus ordered nothing. Kevin bought 2 cups anyway, slid one across the table. That hydraulic line would have killed me. Kevin's directness was jarring after the principal's careful diplomacies, after Eleanor's coded malice. If we'd gone airborne, if Victoria had insisted on that flight to Palm Springs, I'd be dead. Those executives would be dead. And it would have been ruled pilot error, because that's what always happens when rich people die in aircraft failures. "You found the notes. On the clipboard you left. Metal fatigue rupture probability, every detail correct." Kevin paused. "Raphael told me you've been documenting violations for 3 years. Marcus said nothing. Admission meant conspiracy, meant evidence gathering, meant premeditation that company lawyers would twist into malicious intent. "I'm not recording this." Kevin's hands were visible on the table phone, nowhere near. "I'm not trying to trap you. I'm trying to understand why a janitor knows more about helicopter maintenance than the people Victoria pays 6 figures to ensure we don't die. Because I'm not a janitor." The words came out before Marcus could stop them. Exhaustion made people sloppy, made them reveal truths that should stay buried. But Kevin's expression showed no surprise, just confirmation of something he'd already suspected. MIT, Lockheed Martin. 13 years designing the systems Victoria's company pretends to maintain. I lost everything for reporting a safety flaw that nearly killed someone 18 months after they fired me for mentioning it. So yes, I recognize patterns. Yes, I know what metal fatigue looks like. Yes, I've been documenting. Because staying silent makes you complicit, and I've already been silent once with consequences I'll carry forever. Kevin absorbed this. Took a long drink of terrible coffee. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weariness of someone who'd spent years in an industry that valued schedule over survival. "There are 12 pilots at Skywing. All of us know something's wrong. Maintenance deferred, corners cut. But we have mortgages, families' licenses that took years and 6-figure loans to earn. We complain quietly, get told we're overcautious, watch our concerns get buried in paperwork. And we keep flying because what else can we do? Quit and go where the industry is small. Victoria knows everyone. Blacklisting is one phone call. So you stay silent and hope you're not the one in the aircraft when luck runs out. That's the calculation." Kevin's hands tightened on the cup, and I hate myself for it. But I also can't afford to be noble. My daughter starts college next year. My wife has health issues that require insurance I only get through employment. Walking away on principle means destroying their lives. I understand, and Marcus did. Understood it bone deep, because that calculation had driven every decision since Isabel died. Choose between integrity and survival. Choose between speaking up and keeping Nova housed and fed. Choose between being right and being employed. But understanding didn't mean accepting. Didn't mean the calculation was correct just because everyone made it. Sometimes the hard truth was that survival built on silence wasn't survival. It was just slow-motion complicity in the next tragedy. Victoria cut my hours. Marcus laid it out flat. 40% reduction effective immediately. Retaliation for the hydraulic warning. Next step is manufacturing cause for termination. She'll document every minute I work, find something to justify firing me, ensure I can't collect unemployment, or contest the decision. Can you prove retaliation? I can prove everything. 3 years worth. But proof doesn't matter if no one with power cares. Kevin studied him. What are you going to do? What I should have done at Lockheed. What everyone should do when they see the pattern. Stop protecting people who gamble with lives. The implications settled between them. Kevin's expression shifted through calculation, pilot assessment of risk factors, likelihood of survival, consequences of action versus inaction. If you go public, Victoria will destroy you. She has lawyers' money connections. You're a janitor with a termination from Lockheed that she'll use to paint you as vindictive and unreliable. I know. You'll lose this job. Probably can't work aviation anywhere. Your daughter suffers. I know. So why do it? Marcus looked out the window. Across the parking lot, Nova sat in the Honda eating ice cream backpack beside her holding library books and homework, in the simple faith that her father would take care of things. 8 years old. Same age Marcus had been when he'd first wondered why the world was so often cruel to people who deserve better. Why speaking truth seemed to cost more than it should. Why the math of morality never quite worked out the way teachers and preachers claimed. Because she's watching, learning what I do when things get hard, and I'd rather teach her that fighting costs everything than teach her that silence is survival. Kevin stood, extended his hand. When you go public, if you need a pilot to corroborate your evidence, call me. I'm tired of calculating whether today's the day my number comes up because Victoria wanted to shave maintenance costs. You'll lose your job. Probably. But I'll keep my daughter. Not literally, she'll still be there either way. But the version of me she respects, that guy disappears if I keep flying aircraft. I know we're unsafe and pretending it's fine because mortgages and insurance. They shook. Marcus watched Kevin leave, then returned to the Honda where Nova had finished the ice cream and started her homework. The math problems involved fractions, percentages, the kind of calculations that worked predictably because numbers followed rules that didn't bend for power or money. If only everything else worked that way. The meeting with Cassandra Drummond was scheduled for 2 a.m. Marcus left Nova with their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, retired teacher, kind enough to watch an 8-year-old a few nights per month without asking questions that Marcus couldn't answer honestly. He told Nova he had to work extra hours, which was true in the way that all necessary lies carried kernels of truth wrapped in protective deception. The Denny's off Interstate 80 smelled like decades of grease and industrial coffee. At 2 a.m., it held the night shift workers, the insomniacs, the people whose lives ran on schedules that made sense only to them. Marcus took a booth in the back, ordered coffee he wouldn't drink. Waited. Cassandra Drummond arrived at 2:07. She was 48, according to the Washington Post bio. Marcus had researched her byline attached to investigations that had taken down senators, exposed defense contractor fraud, revealed patterns of corruption that people in power had assumed would stay buried because whistleblowers rarely survived long enough to see justice delivered. She slid into the booth across from him without introduction, opened a laptop that looked expensive, but worn the tool of someone who used technology hard because information mattered more than equipment. You're the janitor with the MIT degree. Former engineer, current janitor. I looked you up. Lockheed Martin Skunk Works top secret clearance, 13 years designing helicopter avionics. Fired for reporting a safety flaw that turned out to be real. They called it a conflict of interest. Said I accepted improper gifts. Industry standard stuff they pretended was ethics violation. And now you're mopping floors in Nevada, documenting the same patterns at a luxury charter company. Cassandra's directness was refreshing after weeks of careful language-coded phrases, the constant navigation of power dynamics that required translating everything through layers of implication. That's either dedication to safety or pathological inability to let things go. Or both. She smiled, slight but genuine. Show me what you have. Marcus pulled the USB drive from his pocket. 3 years of work compressed into 64 gigabytes. He'd spent the previous week organizing everything, creating reference documents, writing summaries that provided context for each piece of evidence. The kind of preparation that only came from understanding federal regulatory procedures, from knowing how investigations worked, from years of experience in classified programs where documentation wasn't optional. Cassandra plugged in the drive. Her expression stayed neutral as she opened files, but her fingers moved faster, clicking through folders, opening images, reading maintenance logs that showed clear patterns of falsification. 241 pages. She looked up. You built a federal case. I built truth in a format that can't be easily dismissed. Photographs. GPS stamped, time-stamped, metadata intact. Voice recordings from public areas legally obtained in Nevada's one-party consent framework. Email correspondence recovered from trash. Maintenance logs showing serial numbers unchanged despite records claiming parts replaced. Cassandra opened a spreadsheet Marcus had created. 91 maintenance issues documented over 36 months. 78 signed off improperly. 52 operational necessity overrides. Pattern analysis showing 34% budget reduction during period of consistent flight hour increases. This is comprehensive. Cassandra's voice carried professional assessment rather than emotion. But comprehensive doesn't mean publishable. I need corroboration from other sources. Interviews with current or former employees. FAA records showing complaints were filed. Technical experts validating your analysis. Kevin Sullivan will talk. Pilot at Skywing. He's ready to corroborate maintenance concerns. One pilot isn't enough. I need patterns. Multiple sources saying the same thing independently. Rafael Ortega, the mechanic who signed most of these logs. He's been pressured for years. He might talk if he gets immunity. Might isn't enough. And immunity is something prosecutors offer, not journalists. Cassandra scrolled through more files, stopped at one folder, opened audio files labeled by date and location. Conference room C2241108.wave. She played it. Victoria's voice came through clearly giving instructions to someone Marcus recognized as Garrett Bishop, the COO. The citation needs to be cleared by Thursday morning. Hargrove's flying to DC and we can't delay. I don't care if the landing gear inspection isn't complete. Sign it off completed when he returns Friday. Use the operational necessity protocol. But the regulations require Garrett, we've discussed this. The protocol exists for situations exactly like this. Board members don't operate on our maintenance schedule. We operate on theirs. The recording continued for 6 more minutes. Details about inspection timelines, regulatory workarounds, explicit instructions to defer maintenance for schedule accommodation. When it ended, Cassandra sat back. That's solicitation of federal violations. Recorded in a conference room where you had legal access. I was cleaning. The door was open. Conference rooms are common areas during business hours. Single-party consent in Nevada means I don't need permission to record conversations I'm legitimately present for. You know the law well for a janitor? I know the law well because I spent years in classified programs where documentation meant the difference between accountability and cover-up. I learned those lessons at Lockheed, applied them here. Cassandra closed the laptop. How long have you been planning this? 3 years? Or maybe just 3 weeks? Depends whether you count documentation as planning or just insurance. I didn't start collecting evidence intending to expose Skywing. I started because I needed proof I wasn't imagining things. That the pattern I saw was real. That if they tried to destroy me like Lockheed did, I'd have evidence showing why. But now you're ready to go public. Now they threaten my daughter. Cut my income to force me out. Made clear that being right doesn't matter, only knowing your place matters. So yes, I'm ready. Ready to watch this company burn if that's what accountability requires. Cassandra studied him. The assessment of someone who'd interviewed hundreds of sources, who'd learned to separate truth tellers from attention seekers, who'd seen what happened when whistleblowers underestimated the cost of speaking. You understand what this means. Once I publish, your name goes public. Victoria will know it was you. She'll sue for breach of contract, theft of proprietary information, anything her lawyers can manufacture. She'll destroy your reputation, your employability, your daughter's privacy. You'll become the story as much as the corruption you're exposing. I understand. Do you? Because whistleblowers imagine vindication. They imagine justice and acknowledgement and gratitude. What they get is years of legal battles, death threats, job blacklisting, and watching their families suffer while the people they exposed hire crisis management firms and slowly rebuild while you're still paying lawyers. I watched my wife die because I chose severance over fighting, chose silence over principle, taught my daughter that speaking up means losing everything. So yes, I understand the cost, but I also understand that staying silent doesn't actually protect her. Just teaches her that the world is exactly as small and cruel as the people who run it want it to be. Cassandra nodded, slow, considering. Give me 6 weeks. I need to verify everything independently. Interview sources. File FOIA request for FAA records. Build a case that doesn't depend solely on your evidence. If this is real and preliminary review suggests it is, I'll publish. Front page digital print edition following. Full investigation. But 6 weeks minimum. I can give you 6 weeks. But I need something from you, What when you publish the framing matters? This isn't disgruntled employee seeking revenge. This is engineer watching patterns repeat, watching safety violations accumulate, trying proper channels that failed, finally going public because silence makes you complicit. That context, Lockheed vindication, wife's death, daughter's future, that's not background. That's why the story matters. I'll tell it right. Cassandra's voice carried the commitment of someone who took that responsibility seriously. But Marcus, you need to prepare. Get a lawyer. Document everything Victoria does from now forward. Expect retaliation to escalate. They're going to come after you hard once they realize you're the source. They're already coming. The schedule cut was just opening move. Next is manufactured cause for termination. I give it 2 weeks before they find some policy violation to justify firing me. Then we need to move faster. Let me make some calls. I know FAA investigators who've been trying to build cases against luxury charter companies for years. They'll want to see this. The meeting ended at 3:47 a.m. Marcus drove home through empty streets, past closed businesses, through neighborhoods where people slept soundly because they trusted that systems worked, that regulations protected them, that someone was watching to ensure the aircraft they boarded were maintained properly, and the people running companies were accountable to something beyond quarterly profits. That trust was misplaced. But Marcus couldn't fix systemic failure, could only fix his corner, exposing his pattern hope that enough exposed patterns eventually added up to change. Mrs. Patterson was asleep on his couch when he arrived. He woke her gently, paid her the $40 they'd agreed on, even though it meant his bank balance dropped to a level that made next week's groceries theoretical. She left without questions because people who worked night shifts understood that some things weren't their business. Nova was asleep in her bed, homework completed and organized for morning library books, stacked neatly on the floor because they couldn't afford a bookshelf. Marcus stood in the doorway watching her breathe, wondering what kind of world he was leaving her, whether fighting made anything better or just taught her that principle was code for suffering. His phone buzzed. Email from Victoria. Subject line consultant opportunity. The message was professional, carefully worded, the kind of communication that lawyers reviewed before sending. Mr. Webb, recent events have prompted company review of safety protocols. Your engineering background has come to our attention through updated records verification. We would like to discuss a consulting position focused on maintenance quality assurance. Compensation $18,000 monthly, 6-month contract. Please respond to schedule meeting. Marcus read it twice. The offer was bait, obviously. Victoria had discovered his real background through whatever investigation she'd commissioned after the hydraulic incident. Now she was trying to buy him. $18,000 monthly was more than he'd earn in 3 months at custodial wages. Enough to secure Nova's future payoff medical debt, rebuild the financial stability they'd lost when Isabel died. All he had to do was contextualize safety concerns. Help Victoria frame the violations as misunderstandings, as operational necessities, as the kind of reasonable compromises every aviation company made. Provide expert testimony that her protocols were industry standard, that any suggestion of systematic fraud was overblown. Sell his integrity for comfort. Again, he deleted the email, opened his response. Ms. Ashford, I decline. My engineering expertise is not for sale, particularly not to companies that systematically violate federal safety regulations. You'll hear from me again, soon, through proper channels this time. Channels you can't ignore. Send it before second thoughts could interfere. Felt the bridge burn, the last possibility of comfortable resolution disappearing, the point of no return crossed. His phone rang 30 seconds later. Unknown number. Marcus answered. Mr. Thorne. Victoria's voice carried ice and calculation. That's your real name, isn't it? Marcus James Thorne? MIT class of 2008, Lockheed Martin until 21. Terminated for ethics violations. You mean terminated for reporting ethics violations? Important distinction. I'm offering you $18,000 per month. That's life-changing money for someone in your circumstances. Why refuse because you're not offering money? You're offering silence. And I've already sold that once. Cost my wife the husband she deserved, cost my daughter the father she needed, cost me the ability to look at myself without seeing someone who chose survival over principle. Not making that mistake again. I can make your life very difficult. You already have. Schedule cut, retaliation, threats. What's left? Firing me, do it. Gives me wrongful termination lawsuit on top of everything else. Victoria's voice shifted. Less ice, more calculation. You have a daughter, Nova, 8 years old, Westside Elementary. Smart girl, science prodigy from what I understand. It would be unfortunate if her education was disrupted by her father's poor decisions. The threat hung there. Explicit enough to be clear. Vague enough to maintain deniability. If you threaten my daughter again, Marcus kept his voice level, but let the steel show through. Every conversation we have from now on gets recorded and forwarded to federal investigators. Every email saved. Every interaction documented. You've been cutting corners for 6 years. I've been documenting for 3. The question isn't whether you broke federal law. That's established. The question is how much prison time you want. You're bluffing. Try me. Silence on the line. Then Victoria's voice, colder than before. You'll regret this. Maybe. But I'll regret it with my daughter knowing I tried. That's worth more than your money. He ended the call, blocked the number, forwarded the entire conversation to Cassandra with a note, escalation as predicted. She threatened Nova directly. This needs to be part of your article. Pattern isn't just safety fraud, it's witness intimidation, retaliation, systematic abuse of power. The response came back in minutes received. This helps actually, shows consciousness of guilt. Keep documenting everything. Marcus set the phone down, checked on Nova one more time. She'd shifted position, one arm flung over her head, blanket kicked off despite the cold. He covered her again, adjusted the space heater they ran on low because utility bills were already stretched past reasonable. Tomorrow he'd go to work, finish his reduced shift, collect his reduced paycheck. Wait for Victoria's next move knowing it would come soon, because powerful people couldn't tolerate defiance, couldn't accept that someone they dismissed might be the person who brought them down. But tonight in this moment, watching his daughter sleep peacefully, despite everything, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt since Lockheed destroyed his career. Not peace exactly, not confidence in outcomes because outcomes were uncertain and justice was never guaranteed. Just clarity. The clean simplicity of having chosen correctly, even when choosing correctly, meant choosing hard. Of knowing that whatever came next, lawsuits, unemployment, Victoria's promised destruction, he'd face it with the dignity Isabel had asked him to show Nova. Bigger than the scorn, that's what she told him to be. Bigger than fear, bigger than the people who tried to make them small, bigger than the calculations that traded principle for survival. He was trying, finally. 3 years late and costing more than it should, but trying nonetheless. And somewhere in Washington, a journalist was building the case that would expose Victoria Ashford's empire of compromised aircraft and deferred accountability. Somewhere at the FAA, investigators would receive Cassandra's inquiries and start pulling records that hadn't been reviewed in years. Somewhere the pattern Marcus had documented would connect to other patterns, other companies, other whistleblowers who tried and failed because they tried alone. This time was different. This time Marcus had spent 3 years building evidence that couldn't be dismissed. This time he had journalists who knew how to investigate and pilots ready to corroborate, and mechanics who'd been waiting for someone to give them permission to stop signing lies. This time the silence was ending. And Victoria Ashford would learn what every person in power eventually learned when they pushed too far, threatened too much, mistook patience for weakness. The janitor she'd dismissed knew exactly how to bring down helicopters. He'd designed them for 13 years. The Washington Post article dropped at 6 a.m. Eastern, 3 a.m. Pacific. Marcus was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee gone cold, watching his laptop screen refresh until the headline appeared in the breaking news section. He mopped their floors for 3 years. Then he brought down their empire. Cassandra had delivered exactly what she'd promised. 4,800 words, every detail verified through independent sources. Photographs from Marcus's documentation displayed with timestamps and GPS coordinates visible. Audio excerpts embedded with transcripts for accessibility. Sidebar profiles of the 4 near-miss incidents that could have killed passengers if luck hadn't held and pilots hadn't been exceptional. The article opened with the hydraulic rupture, Victoria dismissing Marcus's warning, the line filling 8 minutes later, Kevin Sullivan's statement that if they'd been airborne, 7 people would be dead. Then the reveal the janitor Victoria had humiliated, held a master's from MIT, had spent 13 years at Lockheed designing the exact systems Skywing claimed to maintain. Cassandra had buried Victoria methodically. Financial analysis showing maintenance budget cuts while flight hours increased. Email correspondence where Victoria explicitly approved deferring inspections for schedule convenience. Board member Desmond Hargrove's involvement documented through recovered communications showing his personal flights received priority regardless of maintenance status. The evidence was comprehensive, damning, impossible to dismiss as disgruntled employee fabrication, because 3 former Skywing workers had corroborated patterns independently, because FAA records showed anonymous complaints filed and buried, because technical experts had reviewed Marcus's analysis and confirmed every assessment. By 7 a.m., the story was trending nationally. CNN picked it up. MSNBC ran segments. Fox News covered it through their aviation safety correspondent. The narrative was perfect for the 24-hour cycle: underdog, janitor arrogant, CEO systematic, corruption, vindication of the whistleblower who'd been right all along. Marcus's phone started ringing at 7:14. Unknown numbers, probably journalists wanting interviews. He let them go to voicemail. Nova would wake soon, and she deserved breakfast that felt normal, mornings that didn't immediately introduce chaos, childhood that could pretend for a few more hours that her father hadn't just publicly declared war on people with unlimited resources for revenge. But normal died at 7:42 when his phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. Federal marshals en route to your location. You're in protective custody until hearing. Pack essentials for 72 hours. Agent Rachel Whitmore, FAA Office of Inspector General. Marcus stared at the message. Protective custody meant they considered him at risk, meant Victoria's implicit threats had been taken seriously by federal investigators who'd seen what happened when whistleblowers underestimated powerful people's capacity for retaliation. He woke Nova gently. She stirred, opened eyes still heavy with sleep. Baby, we need to pack. We're going on a trip. Where her voice carried confusion and worry, because trips required planning and money they didn't have, and packing at dawn meant emergency, somewhere safe. The words felt inadequate. Some people might be upset about work things. Federal agents want to make sure we're protected. Nova sat up, fully now awake and processing. Like when you tried to help at the helicopter company, Marcus hadn't told her details. But children absorbed information through osmosis, through overheard phone calls, and adult conversations that stopped when they entered rooms. She knew enough to be scared without knowing enough to understand why. Exactly like that. But this time people are listening, people with power to fix things. Will we come back? The question carried weight beyond logistics. Would they return to this apartment, this school, this unstable stability they'd built? Or was this another ending? Another relocation, another lesson that doing right meant losing everything again? I don't know, baby. But wherever we go together. She dressed quickly, packed her backpack with clothes and library books and the science textbook she checked out even though it was 2 grades above her level. Marcus threw their essentials into the duffel bag that had survived 3 moves already, closed documents, medications, the photograph of Isabel that Nova kept beside her bed. The marshals arrived at 8:03, 2 agents professional and efficient. They verified Marcus's identity, swept the apartment for threats he couldn't have anticipated, then escorted them to an unmarked sedan. The safe house was 40 minutes outside Reno, in a development of identical townhomes designed for temporary anonymity. 2 bedrooms furnished corporate bland, no personality or character. The kind of place people stayed when their real lives were suspended, pending resolution of circumstances beyond their control. Agent Whitmore arrived an hour later. She was mid-50s, carrying the competence of someone who'd spent decades investigating federal crimes and had learned to separate legitimate whistleblowers from attention seekers. She sat across from Marcus at the dining table while Nova watched television in the other room, volume low enough that adult conversation could happen without her hearing details she didn't need yet. Your article accelerated everything. Whitmore opened a tablet, pulled up documents. FAA's been investigating Skywing quietly for 18 months. Anonymous complaints, pattern analysis. Nothing concrete enough to move forward. Your documentation changed that. We now have probable cause for criminal investigation, not just administrative action. What happens to Victoria? She's been placed on administrative leave. Skywing's operating certificate is suspended pending full audit. Board members, including Desmond Hargrove, are under investigation for conspiracy to defraud federal regulators. And me, you're a federal witness, which means protection until testimony, cooperation with ongoing investigation, and yes, retaliation from people who have every incentive to discredit or silence you. Marcus absorbed this. How long depends. If Victoria cooperates, takes a plea, acknowledges guilt, maybe months. If she fights, if her lawyers decide destroying your credibility is the best defense strategy, could be years. Federal cases move slowly. Justice delayed, but hopefully not denied. My daughter can't live in a safe house for years. We're working on more permanent solutions. Witness relocation if necessary. But Marcus, you need to understand Victoria's lawyers will attack everything. Your Lockheed termination, your financial desperation, your use of false names on employment applications. They'll paint you as vindictive and unreliable, someone who manufactured evidence to seek revenge for career failures. Let them try. I have 3 years of documentation that's independently verified. Cassandra's article includes statements from pilots and mechanics who corroborate patterns. FAA's own records show complaints were filed. What I don't have is any incentive to fabricate evidence that destroys my life. Whitmore nodded. That's good framing. Stick to that. And Marcus, one more thing. The Lockheed issue. We've been reviewing that case too. Your original safety report was correct. The control system flaw you identified nearly caused a fatal crash in 2022. Company fixed it quietly, never acknowledged your report. We're recommending reopening investigation into your termination. The words landed like absolution. Marcus had known he was right, but knowing didn't heal the wound of being destroyed for being right, didn't restore the career or marriage or stability that Lockheed had taken. Vindication came too late to save Isabel, but maybe not too late to teach Nova that truth eventually surfaced even when power tried to bury it. Thank you, his voice was rough. That matters more than you know. Whitmore stood. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start depositions. You'll need to testify about everything, how you documented what you observed, why you didn't report through internal channels. Victoria's lawyers will try to make you look like a criminal for recording conversations and photographing documents. Stand your ground. You did nothing illegal and everything necessary. She left. Marcus checked on Nova, found her asleep on the couch, exhausted by morning's disruption. He carried her to the bedroom, tucked her in, then returned to the living room where his laptop still displayed Cassandra's article. The comments section was filling with reactions. Thousands of people expressing outrage at Victoria, praising Marcus's courage, sharing their own stories of retaliation for speaking up. But mixed in were the defenders, people arguing that aviation was complicated, that operational necessities existed, that janitors shouldn't be investigating companies, that Marcus probably had ulterior motives. He closed the laptop. Public opinion didn't matter. Only evidence mattered. Only the meticulous documentation that couldn't be dismissed as opinion or interpretation or disgruntled employee exaggeration. His phone buzzed. Text from Kevin Sullivan. Article is everywhere. Victoria's threatening lawsuits against anyone who talks to press. But I already gave statement to FAA investigators. We're in this together now. Another text, this one from a number Marcus didn't recognize but identified itself as Rafael Ortega. They offered me immunity if I testify. Taking it. Should have spoken up years ago. Sorry I didn't. Thank you for having courage I lacked. The coalition was forming. People who'd been silent finding strength in each other, discovering that speaking up felt less dangerous when they weren't alone, when federal protection existed, when someone had already paid the price of going first. The next morning brought formal subpoenas. Victoria Ashford, Garrett Bishop, Desmond Hargrove, all ordered to appear before the Nevada State Aviation Board for emergency hearing on Skywing's operating certificate. Marcus received his subpoena, two primary witness for the prosecution testimony scheduled for December 15th, 3 weeks away. The hearing room filled an hour before proceedings started. Journalists claimed front rows cameras ready. Aviation executives attended to assess implications for their own operations. Families who'd flown Skywing came seeking answers about how close they'd been to disaster. Safety advocates who'd spent years trying to get regulators to take charter aviation seriously finally had the scandal that made their concerns undeniable. Victoria sat at the defense table in a suit that probably cost more than Marcus earned in 6 months. Her lawyer, Mitchell Barnes, had the polished confidence of someone who'd defended executives through dozens of scandals and knew that money usually won, that prosecutors eventually settled, that public outrage faded faster than legal protections for wealthy defendants. Marcus wore the only suit he owned, the one from Isabel's funeral, slightly worn but clean. He'd left Nova at the safe house with federal protection because bringing an 8-year-old to proceedings that would detail her father's systematic documentation of corporate fraud felt cruel. She'd asked if he was going to be okay, and he'd promised yes, knowing that okay was relative, that testifying meant becoming Victoria's target, that legal immunity from prosecution didn't mean immunity from retaliation through civil lawsuits and reputation destruction. Board Chairman Gloria Patterson called the hearing to order. The formality of it felt surreal, procedures and protocols designed to impose order on chaos, to pretend that justice was systematic and predictable, when Marcus's experience suggested it was mostly random, inexpensive, and disproportionately available to people who could afford protracted litigation. Mr. Thorne, please state your name and occupation for the record. Marcus James Thorne, currently unemployed, previously employed by Skywing Aviation as custodial staff under the name M. James Webb. Why did you use a different name? To avoid employers Googling my Lockheed Martin termination and rejecting my applications automatically. I used my legal middle name and my mother's maiden name, both permissible. Background checks verified I had no criminal record and acceptable credit. Nothing beyond that was requested. What is your educational background? Bachelor of Science Aerospace Engineering, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 2005. Master of Science, same field, 2007. Graduated with distinction. Thesis on hydraulic system redundancy in rotary wing aircraft. The credentials landed hard. Marcus watched Victoria's lawyer make notes, probably preparing arguments about why someone with MIT engineering degree working as janitor proved instability or desperation that called his objectivity into question. Employment history after MIT, Lockheed Martin Skunk Works Division 2007 to 2021. Senior engineer specializing in helicopter avionics and flight control systems. Top secret OSSCI clearance. Led design teams on classified programs. 13 years until termination. Why were you terminated? Official reason was conflict of interest. Real reason was reporting a safety defect in a classified program. The company claimed I accepted improper gifts from contractors. Industry standard interactions they pretended were ethics violations. I signed NDA and took severance rather than fight while my wife was dying of cancer. When did the safety flaw you reported manifest? 18 months after my termination, November 2022. Test pilot nearly died when the control system failed exactly as my analysis predicted. Lockheed fixed it quietly. Never acknowledged my report was accurate. The timeline established Patterson directed Marcus to his Skywing employment. He testified methodically, walking through his first observations of maintenance irregularities, the decision to document rather than report through internal channels, because Lockheed had taught him what happened to engineers who trusted proper channels led to people who cared. The evidence presentation took 3 hours. Marcus projected photographs on the hearing room screen, fuel filters marked replaced carrying unchanged serial numbers, hydraulic lines signed off as inspected, showing visible stress fractures, landing gear maintenance logs, falsified to show compliance with mandatory intervals. Each image included timestamped GPS coordinates metadata proving authenticity. The audio recordings played next. Victoria's voice authorizing operational necessity overrides. Garrett Bishop instructing Rafael Ortega to sign incomplete inspections. Desmond Hargrove calling to ensure his personal flights receive priority regardless of maintenance requirements. The conversations were damning, not just for content, but for casualness, the routine nature of decisions that treated federal safety regulations as suggestions rather than requirements. Mitchell Barnes cross-examined with aggressive precision. He attacked Marcus's credibility, his use of false names, his financial desperation, his admitted recordings of conversations without explicit consent from all parties. Mr. Thorne, isn't it true you were terminated from Lockheed Martin for ethics violations? I was terminated for reporting ethics violations. The company manufactured conflict of interest charges as retaliation. Subsequent events vindicated my safety concerns. But you signed an NDA admitting wrongdoing. I signed an NDA to receive severance I needed while my wife was dying. Signing doesn't mean guilt. Just means I couldn't afford to fight a company with unlimited legal resources while managing terminal cancer care and raising a 6-year-old daughter. You used a false name to gain employment at Skywing. I used my legal middle name and mother's maiden name, both permissible. No laws violated. Background checks confirm this. You recorded conversations without consent from other parties. I recorded conversations in public areas under Nevada's one-party consent law. Every recording was legal, audio captured, while I performed legitimate custodial duties in conference rooms and maintenance bays where I had authorized access. But your real purpose was gathering evidence, not cleaning. My real purpose was survival, feeding my daughter, paying rent. The documentation started as insurance in case Skywing tried what Lockheed tried, became evidence when patterns proved systematic rather than isolated. Barnes shifted tactics. You're seeking financial compensation through lawsuit. Correct, I'm seeking accountability. If compensation comes as consequence of Victoria Ashford's illegal retaliation, that's justice, not motivation. You stand to profit significantly from this scandal. Book deals, movie rights, speaking engagements. I stand to lose my career permanently. My daughter's stability, years of my life, to legal proceedings, and any chance of working in aviation again. If you think that's profitable, your math is worse than your ethics. The gallery reacted, some laughter, some gasps at Marcus's bluntness. Patterson gavelled for order but didn't reprimand him. The truth was self-evident in ways that didn't require diplomatic phrasing. Barnes tried several more angles suggesting photographs could be manipulated, claiming maintenance irregularities were minor, and corrected, promptly arguing that operational necessity protocols existed precisely for situations Victoria utilized them. None of it worked because Marcus had anticipated every defense had documented not just violations but patterns showing systematic rather than occasional compromise. The prosecution called Kevin Sullivan next. The pilot testified about flying aircraft he knew had deferred maintenance, about complaining through internal channels and watching concerns get buried, about finding Marcus's notes on the hydraulic line and realizing the janitor understood aircraft systems better than the people signing maintenance logs. Rafael Ortega testified with visible distress. He admitted signing inspections that weren't complete, explained the pressure from management, the threats about employment if he delayed aircraft, the gradual normalization of falsifying records, because everyone did it and nobody had died yet, and jobs were scarce in aviation maintenance. 3 former Skywing employees testified to similar patterns. The documentation was overwhelming. The case was airtight. Victoria took the stand in her own defense. Her testimony was carefully crafted. She acknowledged mistakes in judgment, claimed operational pressures, justified certain decisions, insisted no intentional safety violations occurred. She portrayed herself as a daughter trying to maintain her father's legacy, a CEO making difficult choices in competitive market, a woman unfairly targeted by a vindictive employee who'd manipulated legitimate business decisions into criminal narrative. But under cross-examination, she crumbled. The prosecutor played her recorded conversations authorizing specific violations, showed emails where she explicitly ordered maintenance deferrals, presented board minutes where she'd minimized safety concerns raised by pilots. Ms. Ashford, you testified that no intentional violations occurred, but this email from September 2024 shows you instructing Garrett Bishop to clear an aircraft regardless of incomplete inspection. How do you explain that Victoria's composure fractured? That was taken out of context. The operational necessity protocol allows. The protocol requires documentation and immediate follow-up inspection. Neither occurred. You approved flight with known maintenance deficiencies. That's not context, that's federal crime. The case concluded at 6 p.m. Patterson announced deliberations would take 48 hours minimum. Verdict would be delivered publicly with full findings. Media could attend, but recording during deliberation was prohibited. Marcus left through the back entrance to avoid press. Federal marshals escorted him to the waiting sedan where Nova sat finishing homework, oblivious to testimony that had just detailed her father's 3-year documentation of corporate fraud. How was it, Daddy Long Baby? But honest, everything's out now. No more secrets. Are we going home? Not yet. Soon, maybe. Depends what happens next. What they both knew but didn't say home wasn't the apartment they'd left. Home was wherever they ended up after this finished. After Victoria's lawyers exhausted appeals, after the safe house residency ended, and witness protection determined whether relocation was necessary. Home was theoretical, aspirational, dependent on outcomes neither could control. The verdict came on December 18th. Marcus sat in the gallery between federal agents who'd become familiar through weeks of protection. Nova was at the safe house with a supervisor because if the verdict went badly, if Victoria somehow escaped consequences, the marshals wanted Marcus movable immediately. Patterson entered carrying documents that would determine whether 3 years of evidence mattered, whether whistleblowing achieved anything beyond personal destruction, whether the system occasionally worked for people without money and lawyers. The board has reached unanimous decision on all 14 counts presented against Skywing Aviation and CEO Victoria Ashford. The room fell silent. Marcus's heart pounded hard enough that he wondered if the agents beside him could hear it, if his anxiety was visible, if 3 years of careful documentation and risk would be vindicated or dismissed. Count 1, falsification of federal maintenance records. Guilty. The word landed like electricity. Victoria's lawyer grabbed her arm as she started to stand. Patterson continued methodically through all 14 counts. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Each verdict another confirmation that evidence mattered, that truth could overcome wealth, that careful documentation and federal investigators willing to pursue patterns could occasionally deliver accountability. The findings are comprehensive. Patterson's voice carried weight of someone who'd spent decades in aviation oversight and had seen too many near misses that should have been prevented. Skywing Aviation systematically deferred maintenance to reduce costs while increasing flight operations. CEO Victoria Ashford personally authorized 52 violations of mandatory inspection protocols. Board member Desmond Hargrove used his position to prioritize personal travel over safety compliance. COO Garrett Bishop implemented policies that pressured mechanics to falsify records. This wasn't mistakes in judgment. This was calculated decision to value profit over human life. The fact that no fatalities occurred is testament to pilot skill and luck, not company safety culture. Sentencing recommendations to federal prosecutors. Victoria Ashford, 6 years federal prison. Desmond Hargrove, 18 months. Garrett Bishop, 4 years pending cooperation. Skywing Aviation's operating certificate permanently revoked. All assets liquidated to pay fines and restitution. The gallery erupted. Victoria sat motionless, face drained of color. Her lawyer was already on his phone, probably calling appeals attorneys, preparing arguments about excessive sentencing and procedural irregularities. But the damage was done. Guilty on all counts. Federal referral for criminal prosecution. Career over. Company destroyed. Legacy ruined. Marcus felt nothing initially. No triumph, no vindication, no satisfaction. Just exhaustion and the hollow awareness that justice was expensive, that even winning meant losing years to litigation, that Nova's childhood had been sacrificed on the altar of principle. Then Kevin Sullivan was beside him, hand extended. You did it, held them accountable, made aviation safer. We did it. Marcus shook his hand. You testified, Raphael testified, Cassandra investigated. This wasn't one person. This was everyone who'd been silent, finding voice simultaneously. But you went first. That matters. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed. Marcus declined interviews through the federal agents who formed protective barrier. He had nothing to say that wasn't already in testimony, already in Cassandra's article, already established through 3 years of documentation. But one journalist pushed through local reporter from Reno Gazette. Just one question, Mr. Thorne. Was it worth it? Marcus stopped, considered. The honest answer was complicated because worth required calculating costs against benefits, and the costs were still accumulating while benefits remained theoretical. Ask me again in 5 years, when my daughter's old enough to understand what happened, when we see if the reforms actually materialize, when we know if other whistleblowers feel safer because someone went first and survived. Right now, I can tell you it was necessary. Necessary doesn't always mean worth it. The reporter scribbled notes. What's next for you, taking my daughter home? Wherever that ends up being. Finding work that doesn't involve aviation or corporations or people with enough power to destroy careers for speaking truth. Living quietly. Hoping that the lessons she learned through this are about courage rather than cost. Do you regret it every day? And not at all. The question assumes those are opposites. They're not. You can regret the necessity of hard choices while still making them because the alternatives are worse. He left before more questions could come. The marshals drove him to the safe house where Nova waited homework spread across the dining table pretending everything was normal because children needed stability even when stability was performance. She looked up when he entered. Did you win? The judge agreed that I was right, that the company broke laws, that people need to be held accountable. So we're safe now, Marcus sat beside her. Baby safe is complicated. The people who were making bad choices will face consequences. But there might be others who are angry that I spoke up. So we'll be careful for a while longer, until things settle. Can we get a dog? Her question came out of nowhere. 8-year-old logic that equated safety with permanence with the kind of commitment that pets required. Maybe. When we have a permanent home, when we know where we're staying, will we ever know that? The question cut deeper than she probably intended. Would they ever have stability? Would Marcus ever work again? Would the lawsuit Victoria's lawyers inevitably filed consume their lives for years? Would witness relocation become necessary, or could they return to something resembling normal? I promise we'll get there. Might take time, might be different than we imagined, but we'll get there. Nova returned to homework. Math problems that had right answers, equations that balanced predictably, the kind of certainty that life rarely provided. That evening, around 7, Nova fell asleep early on the couch, exhausted by tensions she couldn't fully understand. Marcus carried her to bed, tucked her in, then returned to the kitchen where his laptop waited. He opened a new document and began drafting an outline for congressional testimony. Rachel Whitmore had emailed earlier, Senate Commerce Committee wanted him to testify in March about industry-wide aviation safety reform. This was his chance to turn personal vindication into systemic change, to ensure other whistleblowers wouldn't face what he'd faced, to build protections that made speaking up less catastrophic. The scope was enormous. Not just Skywing, but patterns across charter aviation. Not just maintenance fraud, but regulatory capture, the revolving door between industry and oversight, the incentive structures that rewarded cost-cutting and punished safety advocacy. Later that night, past midnight, Marcus still worked at the kitchen table. Sleep felt impossible with adrenaline from the verdict still coursing through him, with the weight of what came next pressing down. His phone buzzed at 2:17 a.m. Text from Cassandra. Senate Commerce Committee confirmed. March 8th testimony. 3 days in D.C., full expenses covered. This is your chance to turn personal vindication into systemic change. Don't waste it. 3 months away. Time to prepare testimony that went beyond Skywing, that addressed patterns across charter aviation, that provided roadmap for reforms, making it harder for the next Victoria Ashford to gamble with passenger lives. Marcus typed acknowledgement, then returned to his outline. The recommendations were taking shape: mandatory anonymous reporting channels with federal protection, whistleblower compensation programs funded by industry rather than government, surprise maintenance audits conducted by FAA without advance notice, criminal penalties for executives who authorize safety violations. At 2:34 a.m. his phone rang. Unknown number. Marcus hesitated, then answered. Mr. Thorne, this is Catherine Brennan. I'm calling from Lockheed Martin's legal department. Marcus's entire body tensed. The company that destroyed his career calling now after vindication was public and denial was impossible. We've reviewed the FAA investigation into your 2021 termination. The findings are consistent with your original safety report. The control system flaw you identified was real. Our handling of your complaint and subsequent termination was improper. Lockheed Martin would like to offer formal apology and discuss restitution, back pay for the period between termination and present, restoration of professional reputation, reference letters acknowledging your expertise, and we'd like to discuss consulting opportunities if you're interested. Marcus let the words settle. Apology coming 5 years too late to save Isabel, to prevent financial catastrophe, to spare Nova from poverty and instability. But coming nonetheless because vindication had made ignoring him expensive, because congressional testimony would be worse if Lockheed's misconduct was highlighted alongside Skywing's. I appreciate the call, but I'm not interested in consulting. I'm not interested in returning to an industry that destroys careers for reporting safety issues, then offers apologies when destroying people becomes publicly embarrassing. What I am interested in is Lockheed funding engineering scholarships for children of whistleblowers, named after my wife, Isabel Thorne, who died while I was fighting battles your company made necessary. 30 students per year, full tuition targeted at kids whose parents paid the price for speaking up. You do that, put it in writing, make it permanent, and we'll consider this resolved. Silence on the line. Then I'll present this to leadership. It's a significant commitment. So was destroying my career. So was forcing me to mop floors to survive. So was teaching my daughter that principle costs everything. If Lockheed wants redemption, this is the price. I'll be in touch. The call ended. Marcus set down his phone and stared at the laptop screen where his testimony outline waited. The words he'd written blurred as exhaustion finally caught up, as the weight of everything: verdict, media, phone calls, Nova's quiet question about ever having permanent home pressed down until moving felt impossible. But he returned to the outline anyway, kept writing, because testimony mattered, because systemic reform required specific recommendations, because turning personal suffering into structural change was the only way any of this made sense. Marcus worked until 3 in the morning, until the outline was complete, until recommendations were documented with citations and precedents and cost-benefit analyses. His eyes burned. His back ached from hunching over the laptop. But the work was done. He saved the file, closed the laptop, then padded quietly to Nova's room. She'd kicked off her blankets despite the December cold. He covered her, gently adjusted the space heater, stood watching her breathe peacefully in sleep that came easily to children who trusted their fathers to handle the complicated things. Tomorrow would bring more phone calls, more pressure, more decisions about what came next. But tonight, in this moment, watching his daughter sleep soundly in temporary safety they'd carved from chaos, Marcus felt something close to peace. Not victory, not resolution, just clarity. He'd testified honestly. Evidence had mattered. Victoria would face consequences. Lockheed had acknowledged their wrong. Senate testimony would come. Reforms might follow. And Nova slept peacefully because her father had shown her that speaking up didn't always destroy you, that patience and documentation could deliver accountability, that the world was bigger than the people who tried to make it small. Isabel had asked him to show Nova something bigger than fear. He'd tried. Finally, years late and costing more than it should, but he'd tried and succeeded and survived. That was enough. Marcus returned to the couch that served as his bed, lay down, closed his eyes. And for the first time in 3 years, sleep came easily, dreamlessly, carrying no guilt about silence or complicity or choices that traded principle for survival. The fires had burned slow, but the whole sky was lit. And somewhere other engineers and mechanics and pilots were watching, learning that whistleblowing could survive, that evidence mattered, that one person changing their corner sometimes changed the whole map.